is that the recent accelerated pace of mergers and acquisitions in the United States is not unprecedented. And second, that it is not something that happened overnight. Japanese companies have been in the United States for 30, 40 years, and they have gradually developed to come to a position where they're confident in doing the kinds of M&A transactions today. It's in the 70s, most of the Japanese investments were in forms of greenfield operations, building factories from scratch. America was regarded as an export market. Companies that came to the United States set up sales offices so that their products could be sold more easily. Only in the late 70s, the Japanese companies start thinking about partnerships with American companies in establishing operations in the United States. Probably the one that's most notable is the Takeda-Abbott partnership that took place in 1978, I think, 77 or 78. That, as some of you may know, was a resounding success, and Takeda bought out Abbott last year, Abbott's 50% for about $5 billion, excuse me. In the 80s, what's interesting to note about the 80s was that most people think of the bubble days in the 80s as real estate investment oriented. In fact, there were a lot of acquisitions made by Japanese companies at that time. In retro, almost as many, and people were saying Japanese are coming, they're buying everything, including companies. I think in retrospect, we see that there was a very high rate of failure among the Japanese companies that acquired companies in the 80s. And that's because at that time, they probably jumped into the United States market a little bit too soon for them in terms of having a real knowledge of the culture, the different management styles, and the expectations of the employees. A Japanese company acquiring an American company, in those days the deals weren't as big as they are today. We're talking $50, $100, $150 million deals. The Japanese companies often thought that they could keep the U.S. operation pretty much intact, put in a few high-level Japanese officers, and that the company that ran successfully would continue to run successfully thereafter. It didn't, because the Japanese internal policies required a lot of reporting, some changes in accounting systems that frustrated often the middle management, upper management companies that they acquired. The bubble ended in early, late 80s, early 90s, and I think the Japanese companies took a step back, step back because their financial situation was adversely affected. It took them another 5 years before they started to get active again in the 90s. And this time, we had Japanese companies that had learned from the experience of investments in the 80s, made in the 80s, and a number of strategic buyers came in to look at more significant operations in the U.S. Also, by the 90s, many Japanese companies began to realize that Japan, in the long term, was not going to be a growing economy, and that in order for those companies to become bigger, they had to have a bigger market share of the global marketplace. America continued to be, and still is, the largest marketplace, and therefore was the most attractive place to go. What we're seeing today, basically, this is my personal opinion, and I hope you guys can disagree if you want. I think what you see today in the very large transactions that are taking place, a significant amount of confidence that the Japanese companies have developed because they worked for the last 30 years and have been part of the U.S. business environment. They understand better now how the American management system works, what the American employees are expecting, culturally what they can and can't do. They can't just place the Japanese culture on top of an American company. And in terms of expanding, they recognize that they have to expand using local people who know the marketplace the best. I think the level of confidence can be seen by the number of more recent unsolicited offers Japanese companies have made. This started with Uniqlo outbidding a Dubai sovereign fund in the acquisition of Barney's. Early in '08, Sumitomo Heavy Industries made an unsolicited bid through a bear hug letter of Axcelis, a semiconductor parts company, and most recently Astellas, a pharmaceutical company, making an unsolicited bid for CVT for about $1 billion. These are all, I think, elements of the elements that reflect the confidence Japanese companies have, and I don't see it trending down. I think from here on, you're going to see more Japanese companies becoming very active in the U.S. The only thing I would caution is those companies will probably be very strategic companies. They're not going to be the companies that made investments like in the 80s, but these are companies that are going to be, they know, with pharmaceutical or technology, something where what they make has a global market.